June 15th, 1944. The skies above the Mariana Islands shimmered with the reflection of sunlight on aluminum. From horizon to horizon, the roar of hundreds of engines rolled like distant thunder. Below, Japanese radar operators froze, their screens filled with a storm they had never seen before, vast, deliberate, unstoppable. These were not fighters, not medium bombers, not even the old B-17s they'd faced before. This was something entirely new, something monstrous. The B-29 Superfortress, America's flying giant, had arrived. A machine that could fly higher than Japanese guns could reach, faster than their interceptors could climb, and farther than their empire had ever imagined. Inside each gleaming fuselage sat men who knew the truth. This wasn't just another bombing run. It was a mission that would decide whether Japan could continue to fight or burn trying. From the jungles of Saipan to the smoldering ruins of Tokyo, Japan's Air Force would fight and fail against an enemy born from steel, fire, and American ingenuity. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying city, an angel of destruction that rewrote the rules of war and turned the sky itself into America's deadliest weapon. What followed wasn't just strategy, it was the beginning of the end. Keep watching, because this is the story of how Japan's proud Air Force disintegrated under the wings of the superfortress that no one believed could exist. September 21st, 1942. Wichita, Kansas. In a hangar flooded with light, engineers of Boeing Company gathered around something that looked too massive to fly. A gleaming silver aircraft with a 141-foot wingspan and four R-3350 engines that promised to shatter every record in aviation history. This was the B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced, most expensive, and most ambitious bomber the world had ever seen. America was desperate. The Pacific was a nightmare of blood and distance. Island after island, thousands of miles of ocean, and Japan still far out of reach. The Army Air Forces needed a weapon that could reach Tokyo from bases far beyond the range of any existing bomber. The B-17 Flying Fortress couldn't do it. The B-24 Liberator lacked the altitude. The B-29 was designed to do the impossible: carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles, fly above 30,000 feet, and return home alive. But this technological marvel came at a cost. Its engines overheated and caught fire midair. Its pressurized cabin leaked like a sieve. Entire test crews were lost before the design was perfected. Yet, General Hap Arnold pushed forward. "If this plane works," he said, "it will end the war." And America poured $3 billion, more than the cost of the Manhattan Project, into making it work. By late 1943, factories in Wichita, Omaha, and Seattle ran night and day. Women riveters and young mechanics who had never touched an airplane before assembled the parts of a machine that could carry war farther than any human had ever flown. The B-29 became more than a bomber. It was the embodiment of American industrial willpower, forged in metal and sweat. Every rivet told the same story. This was not just a plane. It was a message to Japan that no island, no city, and no empire would ever be out of reach again. April 1944. Chengdu, China. The ground trembled as the first B-29s of the 20th Air Force taxied across rough, dirt runways carved out by tens of thousands of Chinese laborers. Each bomber's four massive propellers kicked up dust that swirled around the exhausted men who had carried every gallon of aviation fuel, every bullet, every crate of bombs across the Himalayas by truck, mule, and human hand. It was called Operation Matterhorn, and it was madness disguised as strategy. The U.S. didn't yet control islands close enough to Japan for direct strikes, so they launched from India, flying over the hump, the deadly, weather-ravaged mountain passes of the Himalayas, to reach forward bases in China. The crews called it the Aluminum Trail because so many planes crashed and littered the mountains below. By June 15th, 1944, the first B-29 mission against Japan was ready. The target, Yada Iron Works on Kyushu Island, was over 1,500 miles away. Crews climbed into their aircraft under black skies, carrying bombs meant to cripple Japan's war industry. When the engines roared to life, the entire valley seemed to shake. This was a moment America had dreamed of since Pearl Harbor, striking Japan itself. But the mission was a disaster. Headwinds, navigation errors, and mechanical failures plagued the formation. Of the 68 aircraft that took off, only 47 reached Japan. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky, and Japanese fighters rose like hornets, diving on the bombers with fury. Some B-29s burned in midair. Others vanished into clouds of smoke. The few that returned limped back with shredded wings, their crews too shaken to speak. Yet in that chaos, a single fact stood out. America had reached Japan. Even if the results were poor, even if the cost was high, the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese people, for the first time, looked to the sky and saw a war that could finally touch their homeland. For the men who flew those missions, the message was clear. The B-29 wasn't just an aircraft anymore. It was the beginning of Japan's reckoning. November 24th, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The sun had barely risen when the first wave of B-29 Superfortresses began to roll down the newly captured runways of Isley Field. These were the same islands Japan had sworn America would never take, but now they were the launch pads of vengeance. From Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29s could finally strike every corner of Japan without crossing the deadly Himalayas. Inside one of those bombers, Dauntless Dottie, Captain Robert Kincaid adjusted his oxygen mask and looked out over the Pacific. 1,500 miles of empty ocean lay between him and Tokyo. Each aircraft carried 12,000 pounds of bombs and enough fuel to fly 14 hours straight. For the first time, Japan's capital was within reach of America's might. As the formation climbed through thick clouds, Japanese radar stations along the coast screamed warnings. Fighter pilots scrambled from airfields near Tokyo, but they were too late. The B-29s came in from 30,000 feet, higher than most Japanese interceptors could reach. At 12:05 p.m., the first bombs fell on Musashino aircraft plant, shattering windows across the city and sending black smoke curling into the winter sky. But victory wasn't easy. The Japanese launched wave after wave of desperate attacks. Ki-44 and Ki-61 fighters dove through flak bursts, colliding with the bombers in suicidal rams. Anti-aircraft shells exploded like black blossoms around the formation. One B-29, hit in the wing, rolled violently before vanishing into the sea. Another limped home with half its tail gone. By the end of the day, 12 bombers were lost. Yet Tokyo had been bombed for the first time since the Doolittle raid of 1942. The world took notice. The Japanese High Command, once defiant, now faced a new kind of war, one they could neither predict nor stop. And for the men of the 20th Air Force, the message was chilling. Japan's skies were vast, but not invincible. The war had entered a new phase, one fought above the clouds, where death came without warning and mercy was nowhere to be found. March 9th, 1945. Guam, 7 p.m. On the dark runway of North Field, hundreds of aircrews stood beside their planes. The mighty B-29s now modified for a new, terrifying mission. Under the command of General Curtis LeMay, the strategy had changed. High-altitude bombing hadn't broken Japan. The winds were too strong, the targets too scattered, and the results too poor. LeMay's plan was brutally simple. Drop low, drop fire, and burn Tokyo to the ground. At 5,000 feet, not 30,000, the Superfortresses would fly beneath Japan's radar. Their bomb bays were loaded not with high explosives, but with M69 incendiary clusters, small napalm-filled bomblets designed to ignite everything they touched. As the engines roared to life, one crewman muttered, "God forgive us for what we're about to do." Shortly after midnight, the first bombers crossed the Japanese coast. Below them lay a sleeping city of wood and paper, Tokyo, home to nearly 9 million souls. The first wave opened its bays, and streams of fire rained down like molten rain. The wind caught the flames and carried them through neighborhoods, igniting house after house until entire districts glowed red. Within minutes, the capital became a furnace. Japanese firefighters were powerless. The heat melted hoses, and the air itself became unbreathable. Civilians ran for the Sumida River, only to find it boiling with heat and packed with the dead. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing over 100,000 people, more than Hiroshima would months later. From the sky, the B-29 crews watched in stunned silence. Through their plexiglass windows, they saw a city turn to ash, glowing embers stretching as far as the eye could see. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stared, knowing they had unleashed something beyond comprehension. When the bombers returned to Guam, General LeMay said only one thing: "We've finally found a way to end this war." But among the men who flew that night, victory felt like a curse. They had destroyed Tokyo and a part of themselves with it. April 1945. The skies over Japan no longer belonged to the rising sun. The once feared Imperial Japanese Air Force, which had dominated the Pacific in 1941, was now little more than a shadow. Its veteran pilots were dead, its aircraft obsolete, and its airfields burned. The B-29 Superfortresses came day and night, and nothing Japan had left could stop them. From newly captured bases in Tinian, Guam, and Saipan, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched hundreds of bombers every few days. Each carried tons of incendiaries and high explosives. Cities like Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe followed Tokyo into ruin. Entire industrial districts vanished overnight. Japanese radar operators barely had time to warn civilians before the bombers were overhead. The sound of engines became the sound of death. At Osaka, Japanese interceptors, mostly aging Ki-43 Oscars and Ki-61 Tonys, tried desperately to break the formations. But the B-29s flew too high, too fast, and too tight. Their defensive guns, 12.50 caliber Brownings, turned every approach into suicide. Many Japanese pilots resorted to kamikaze attacks, diving their planes into the bombers, hoping to take at least one down with them. For every B-29 lost, Japan lost 10 fighters. By May, General Curtis LeMay had turned destruction into a precise science. Each mission was planned to exploit the weather, the dry winds that fanned the flames, and to devastate Japan's fragile logistics. His crews, hardened and exhausted, no longer flinched at the sight of burning cities. One pilot wrote in his log, "We used to bomb factories. Now we bomb everything." Meanwhile, on the ground, the Japanese people faced a nightmare they couldn't fight. Schools and homes were flattened, water lines burst, and food convoys never arrived. In the ruins of Kawasaki, a mother held her child as she watched the orange glow spread across the city, whispering prayers that no one would ever hear. Survivors described the nights as hell made real, fires sweeping through narrow alleys, sucking the oxygen from the air. And yet, through all this, Japan refused to surrender. Emperor Hirohito's government called it Gyokusai, honorable death. Even as their cities crumbled, the army prepared for invasion, building bunkers, sharpening bamboo spears, and training civilians to die rather than yield. LeMay understood what that meant. He knew firebombing alone wouldn't be enough, but he also knew Japan was running out of time, fuel, and willpower. In May 1945, he authorized the Operation Meeting House Expansion, a relentless series of raids designed to erase Japan's industrial backbone. Between March and August, American bombers dropped 165,000 tons of bombs on 66 cities, killing more than 500,000 civilians and leaving millions homeless. Above the flames, the B-29 crews flew in silence. The heat rose so high that it tossed their massive aircraft like toys. Instruments failed, engines overheated, and smoke blackened the sky. Yet they kept going. They were told every raid brought the war closer to its end, that every city burned meant one less American soldier dying in an invasion. But among the men, doubts began to spread. Some whispered that this wasn't war anymore. It was annihilation. Others said mercy had no place left in a world that had seen Pearl Harbor, Nanking, and Bataan. When General LeMay briefed his crews after the Osaka raid, his voice was flat. "We're not doing this because we hate them. We're doing it because we want it over." By the summer of 1945, Japan's air defense network had collapsed. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. The few fighters left couldn't even take off. What remained of the Japanese Air Force was grounded, starved, broken, and waiting for a war they could no longer fight. Above them, the silver wings of the B-29 Superfortress filled the sky like a judgment. The empire that once dreamed of dominance over Asia now looked up and saw its own destruction, written in smoke. The fire had done its work. But America wasn't finished yet. The most powerful weapon in human history was still waiting, and it would fall from AB-29. August 6, 1945. The morning sun rose gently over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The air was still, the sky perfectly clear, the kind of morning that promised peace after years of endless air raids. Civilians hurried to work, children walked to school, and air raid sirens remained silent. No one imagined that, miles above, a lone B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay was approaching with a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. At 8:15 a.m., Colonel Paul Tibbets steadied the bomber's controls as Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee lined up his sights on the T-shaped AIOI bridge. In the bomb bay, a 9,700-pound device nicknamed Little Boy waited in the cradle of steel. When the release light turned green, Farabee whispered a short prayer and pressed the switch. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. Then in a single blinding flash, the world changed. A fireball hotter than the sun erupted over Hiroshima. Buildings vanished. Shadows burned into concrete. Within seconds, 80,000 people were gone, and tens of thousands more would die in the following days. From the cockpit, the crew of Enola Gay watched a mushroom cloud rise 30,000 feet into the air, a tower of ash and horror that would mark the end of one war and the beginning of a new age. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 boxcar commanded by Major Charles Sweeney took off from Tinian, carrying Fat Man. Their target was Nagasaki, a city shielded by clouds and mountains. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb detonated above the Urakami Valley, obliterating the city center and killing over 70,000. 2 cities gone, 2 flashes of light, and the empire's resolve finally broke. In Tokyo, the silence in the imperial palace was suffocating. Emperor Hirohito, once a symbol of divine strength, now stared at reports of total annihilation. Japan's air force was gone, its city's ashes, its people starving. On August 15, 1945, his voice crackled through the radio waves, the first time his subjects had ever heard him speak. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," he said softly, announcing the unthinkable. Japan would surrender. For the men of the B-29 crews, the war's end brought no triumph, only exhaustion and haunting silence. Some believed they had saved millions by ending the war without an invasion. Others wondered if they had unleashed something humanity could never control again. In their hearts, they knew the truth. They had ended one kind of death by inventing another. As the last B-29s returned to their bases in Guam and Tinian, mechanics wiped the soot from their wings. The Superfortress, once a symbol of invincibility, now stood quiet under the tropical sun. It had carried the weight of firestorms and atomic suns, and in doing so, had rewritten the fate of nations. In the ruins of Hiroshima, a young boy stood among the ashes, staring at the twisted remains of a clock frozen at 8:15. The sky above him was a pale blue, peaceful once again. But for those who had seen what flew through it, the sky would never be the same. The B-29 Superfortress didn't just win the war. It ended an empire, changed warfare forever, and showed mankind that victory could come at the price of its own humanity. Because when the Superfortress appeared, Japan's Air Force didn't just crumble. The world itself fell silent. If you want to understand how technology, courage, and devastation collided to end World War II, stay with this series, because this was not just the end of a war, it was the birth of the atomic age.